Memphis, Tennessee, August 15th, 1977. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. in the modest duplex on Elm Street, cutting through the humid summer darkness like a blade. Sarah Mitchell, barely 17, and fighting a losing battle with leukemia, had been awake for hours, not from pain this time, but from excitement. Tomorrow was supposed to be the day she'd finally see Elvis Presley live at the Mid-South Coliseum. Her mother, Helen, stumbled through the darkened hallway, her heart already sinking. Late-night calls meant one thing in their world: bad news from the hospital, another setback, another door closing. But the voice on the other end wasn't Dr. Peterson. It was trembling, barely coherent, speaking words that would shatter their world in an entirely different way. Elvis is gone. The king is dead. Sarah's scream pierced the night. Not the weak cry of a sick girl, but the raw anguish of someone watching their last dream die. She'd saved every penny from her part-time job at the diner, despite the chemo treatments that left her barely able to stand. The concert tickets, purchased months ago, lay on her nightstand like golden promises of one perfect night. Now they were just paper, worthless reminders of what would never be. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another Elvis fan. She was a dying girl who'd found life in his music during the darkest period imaginable. Diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia at 15, she'd spent the last 2 years cycling between remission and relapse, hope and despair. The doctors had been gentle but clear. Her time was measured in months, not years. In a world where everything felt beyond her control, Elvis's voice became her anchor. Her bedroom walls told the story. Magazine clippings, album covers, and handwritten lyrics covered every inch. Her most prized possession was a worn copy of "Can't Help Falling in Love." Played so many times, the vinyl had developed a permanent skip at her favorite line. Helen would often find her daughter mouthing the words in her hospital bed, eyes closed, transported to a world where pain didn't exist. The Mitchell family had never had much money. Helen worked double shifts at the textile factory, while her husband Robert drove long-haul trucks, desperately trying to cover medical bills that seemed to multiply overnight. But when Sarah's oncologist gently suggested they should make some special memories while there's still time, they scraped together every dollar for those concert tickets. It was supposed to be their miracle, one perfect night before the inevitable goodbye. The cruel irony wasn't lost on them. Elvis Presley, the man who'd given their daughter strength through her darkest hours, had died the day before he was supposed to give her joy. In a world already unfair to a 17-year-old girl facing death, this felt like the cruelest joke of all. This story explores the profound impact one person can have on another's life, even from a distance. It examines how celebrity and fandom can transcend mere entertainment to become sources of genuine comfort and meaning. Most powerfully, it reveals how acts of unexpected kindness, especially in our final moments, can create ripples that last far beyond our own lives. The narrative also delves into the often overlooked humanity of those we place on pedestals. Elvis Presley, despite his fame and personal struggles, remained connected to his fans in ways that went far beyond performance. It's a story about the responsibility that comes with influence and the beautiful burden of bringing joy to others. Finally, this is a meditation on legacy, not just what we leave behind when we die, but what we choose to do with the time we have. It's about finding light in darkness and the extraordinary power of ordinary compassion. 3 days after Elvis's death, as Memphis still reeled from the loss of its most famous son, an unexpected visitor appeared at the Mitchell family's front door. Helen answered the knock to find a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, his face bearing the weight of recent grief. He introduced himself as Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest friends and bodyguards. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have something that belongs to your daughter." Helen's first instinct was confusion, then suspicion. In the days since Elvis's death, all manner of people had emerged claiming connections to the king, selling everything from authentic scarves to personal photographs. But something in Joe's eyes, a genuine sadness mixed with purpose, made her step aside and invite him in. Sarah, wrapped in her mother's old robe and wearing a scarf to cover her bald head, looked up from the couch where she'd been listlessly flipping through an Elvis biography. The sight of this stranger in their humble living room should have excited her, but the last few days had drained her of all enthusiasm. She was dying, and now her hero was dead too. What was left to feel excited about? Joe sat down across from her, pulling out a manila envelope from his jacket. "Sarah," he said gently, "Elvis knew about you. He knew about your illness, and he knew how much his music meant to you." The girl's eyes widened, but Joe continued before she could speak. "3 weeks ago, he asked me to arrange something special for after the concert. He wanted to meet you, to spend some real time with you, not just a quick photo, but a real conversation." The emotional impact hit Sarah like a physical blow. Elvis had known about her, had planned to meet her. The cruel timing of his death suddenly felt even more devastating. Helen reached for her daughter's hand as tears began streaming down both their faces. But Joe wasn't finished. "Elvis had been struggling, Sarah. You know that, don't you? He was fighting his own battles with his health, with his pain. But in those last weeks, when he learned about fans like you, young people fighting so hard just to live, it gave him something to hold on to. He said it reminded him why he sang in the first place." Helen found herself growing defensive, the protective instincts of a mother whose child had suffered too much already. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked, her voice sharp with pain. "She's been heartbroken for 3 days. This just makes it worse. What's the point of knowing what might have been?" Sarah's father, Robert, had been silent in his chair by the window, but now he stood up abruptly. "I think you should leave," he said firmly. "My daughter has been through enough. She doesn't need some story about what Elvis was planning to do. He's gone, the concert's canceled, and she's still dying. That's our reality." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Joe nodded slowly, understanding their pain. He'd seen this same raw grief in Elvis's own family, in the thousands of fans gathered outside Graceland. Death had a way of making hope feel cruel, and kindness feel like salt in an open wound. But Sarah, despite her tears, despite the crushing disappointment of the last 3 days, looked directly at Joe. "What was he going to give me?" she asked quietly. "You said you had something that belongs to me." Joe's weathered face softened as he looked at this brave teenager, bald from chemotherapy, but with eyes that still held curiosity, despite everything she'd endured. He opened the manila envelope slowly, almost reverently, and pulled out a cassette tape and a handwritten letter. "Elvis made this recording for you on August 12th, 3 days before he died," Joe explained. "He'd been thinking about it for weeks, working on it whenever he had quiet moments. He wanted you to have something that was just yours, not a song everyone else had heard, but something personal." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the cassette. The label, written in Elvis's distinctive handwriting, simply read, "For Sarah, keep fighting, darling. Love, Elvis." The sight of her name in his writing felt surreal, like discovering a message from beyond the grave. Helen's anger dissolved as she saw the genuine care in Joe's presentation of these items. This wasn't some publicity stunt or cruel joke. This was a final act of kindness from a man who'd understood what it meant to bring joy to others, even while fighting his own demons. "There's more," Joe said, pulling out the letter. "He wrote this the night before he died. He was planning to give it to you after the concert, but..." His voice trailed off as he handed over the envelope, sealed and addressed to Miss Sarah Mitchell, the bravest girl in Memphis. As Sarah held the letter and cassette tape, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her diagnosis, a connection to something larger than her illness, larger than her fear. Elvis had thought about her in his final days. He'd taken time from his own struggles to create something just for her. In that moment, she realized that his death, while devastating, hadn't erased the gift he'd intended to give. If anything, it had made it more precious. "Should I listen to it now?" she asked, looking between Joe and her parents. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of final gestures and last gift. Whatever was on that tape would be the closest she'd ever come to meeting her hero, and the last new Elvis music she'd ever hear. The cassette tape contained 12 minutes, that would change the Mitchell family forever. Elvis's voice, tender and conversational, spoke directly to Sarah as if she were sitting right there with him at Graceland. He talked about his own struggles with health, about the nights when he couldn't sleep, and found comfort in knowing that somewhere out there, fans like her were finding strength in his music. But it was the song that broke everyone's heart. Elvis had taken "You'll Never Walk Alone," a hymn about hope and perseverance, and rewritten portions of it specifically for Sarah. His voice, raspier than in his prime but filled with emotional depth, sang about fighting battles that seem impossible, about finding light when darkness feels endless. The final lines, "Sarah, you'll never walk alone, darling, because you're walking with the King," left everyone in the room in tears. Word of the recording leaked within days. A well-meaning nurse at the hospital, who'd heard Sarah playing the tape during treatment, mentioned it to a local radio DJ. By the end of the week, news crews were camped outside the Mitchell family's modest duplex. The story, Elvis's final recording for Dying Fan, spread like wildfire through a nation still mourning the King's death. The media attention was overwhelming and invasive. Reporters pushed microphones toward Sarah's face as she tried to walk to chemotherapy appointments, asking her to describe how it felt to receive Elvis's last gift. Tabloid photographers climbed trees to peer into their backyard, hoping to catch candid shots of the Elvis girl. Helen found herself screening dozens of calls from journalists, talk show producers, and Elvis impersonators claiming they could somehow recreate the experience for Sarah. The family's private grief had become public entertainment, and with it came an avalanche of criticism from unexpected sources. Some Elvis fans accused Sarah of fabricating the story for attention. Others claimed that if Elvis had really made personal recordings for dying fans, where were the tapes for other sick children? Radio psychics emerged claiming to channel Elvis's spirit, insisting the recording was either fake or that Elvis's ghost had more messages to share. The backlash intensified when a prominent Elvis collector publicly questioned the authenticity of the recording. Marcus Webb, who owned what he claimed was the world's largest collection of Elvis memorabilia, appeared on a Memphis television program declaring that he'd never heard of Elvis making personal recordings for fans. "I knew Elvis personally," Webb stated with authority, "and this sounds like a publicity stunt by a family looking for sympathy and possibly money." The accusation hit the Mitchell family like a physical blow. Helen had to take time off work to deal with the constant phone calls and visitors, losing wages they desperately needed for Sarah's medical care. Robert found himself getting into heated arguments with co-workers who'd heard the news and either pitied or doubted them. Worst of all, Sarah began questioning whether the recording was real, despite having heard it with her own ears. The situation deteriorated further when someone broke into their home while the family was at the hospital. Nothing valuable was stolen, but Sarah's Elvis collection was destroyed. Albums smashed, posters torn down, her carefully preserved magazine clippings scattered across the floor like confetti. Spray-painted on her bedroom wall was a cruel message: "Fake king for fake fan." Sarah's health began declining rapidly, but now it wasn't just the leukemia. The stress of the media attention, the doubt cast on her most precious possession, and the violation of her safe space sent her into a deep depression. She stopped eating regularly, refused to play the Elvis tape, and asked her parents to throw away the remaining pieces of her damaged collection. Dr. Peterson, her oncologist, took Helen aside during one of their visits. "I'm concerned about Sarah's mental state," he said gently. "Sometimes, when patients lose hope, their bodies give up fighting too. Whatever's happening at home, you need to find a way to give her back some peace." But peace seemed impossible. The phone rang constantly with interview requests, legal threats from Elvis's estate, claiming unauthorized use of his image, and cruel calls from strangers who'd somehow gotten their number. The tape that was supposed to be Elvis's gift of comfort had become the source of their greatest torment. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife and the guardian of his estate, had been quietly investigating the claims surrounding Sarah's tape. She'd heard the media speculation and the accusations of fraud, but something about the family's story resonated with her memories of Elvis's genuine care for his fans. Working with Joe Esposito and other members of Elvis's inner circle, Priscilla discovered documentation that supported the Mitchell family's claim. In Elvis's personal calendar, found among his effects at Graceland, was a note in his handwriting, August 12th, record message for sick girl in Memphis. Joe has details. Additionally, they found the original reel-to-reel master tape in Elvis's home studio, along with several practice versions where he'd worked out the lyrics and phrasing. But the most powerful evidence came from Elvis's longtime friend and spiritual advisor, Larry Geller, who revealed that Elvis had been deeply affected by letters from seriously ill fans in his final months. He couldn't perform the way he used to, Geller explained to a gathering of media at Graceland, but he wanted to find other ways to give something back. Making personal recordings was his way of reaching out when he couldn't reach out physically. Priscilla decided to make a public statement that would end the speculation once and for all. Standing in the living room at Graceland, surrounded by Elvis's personal belongings and memories, she spoke directly to the cameras. Elvis Presley did make a personal recording for Sarah Mitchell. He did so out of love and compassion for a young fan facing an unimaginable battle. Anyone who questions this is questioning the very heart of who Elvis was as a person. The vindication brought relief, but by then, the damage to Sarah's spirit was severe. She'd spent weeks doubting the authenticity of what had felt like a miracle, and the stress had accelerated her illness. Time was running out, and the gift that was meant to bring comfort had nearly been destroyed by the cruelty of skeptics and the invasion of the media. However, Priscilla wasn't finished. She announced that the Elvis Presley estate would be establishing a foundation in Sarah's honor, not for publicity, but because Elvis would have wanted his final act of kindness to create lasting help for other young people facing serious illnesses. The foundation would provide comfort items, experiences, and support for children in hospitals, ensuring that Sarah's story would help others long after she was gone. The validation from Priscilla Presley and the Elvis estate transformed everything for the Mitchell family, but more importantly, it restored Sarah's faith in the gift she'd received. However, the real redemption came from an unexpected phone call on a quiet Tuesday evening in late September. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Even weakened by age and emotion, it carried the authority of someone who'd stood beside the king for decades. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's legendary manager, had remained silent throughout the media circus surrounding Sarah's tape. Known for his shrewd business sense and protective nature regarding Elvis's image, many expected him to dispute the story. Instead, he called the Mitchell home personally to share something he'd never told anyone. "Young lady," the colonel said in his distinctive accent, "I want you to know that in all my years managing Elvis, I never saw him more thoughtful about anything than he was about that recording for you. He spent 3 hours getting it just right, starting over every time he felt his voice wasn't strong enough or his words weren't personal enough." Parker revealed that Elvis had actually planned to make more recordings for other sick fans, but his death had cut those plans short. "You weren't just one of many," he told Sarah. "You were the beginning of something Elvis wanted to do with the time he had left. He saw in your fight the same spirit he'd been trying to find in himself." The colonel's endorsement carried weight in ways that even Priscilla's hadn't. This was the man who'd built Elvis's career, who'd negotiated every major deal, who'd protected the Elvis brand with fierce determination. For him to publicly acknowledge the authenticity of Sarah's gift was more than vindication. It was a recognition that this 17-year-old girl had touched the heart of the entertainment industry's most guarded figure. As word of the colonel's endorsement spread, something beautiful began to happen. Other Elvis associates came forward with their own memories of the king's compassion toward fans. Stories emerged of hospital visits that were never publicized, of personal checks sent to families facing medical bills, of phone calls to children who'd written heartbreaking letters. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation established by the Elvis estate, became a beacon for families facing pediatric illness. Within 6 months, it had provided comfort packages to over 500 children in hospitals across the country. Each package included music, books, and a personal recording from various artists who'd been inspired by Elvis's final act of kindness. But the Foundation's most powerful program was the Personal Song Project, where musicians would create customized recordings for seriously ill children, just as Elvis had done for Sarah. Major artists like Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, and even Paul McCartney contributed recordings, but so did local musicians, school choir directors, and even amateur singers who simply wanted to bring comfort to a child they'd never met. Sarah became the reluctant but determined spokesperson for the foundation, despite her declining health. She spoke at fundraising events when she was strong enough, always emphasizing that the gift wasn't just about Elvis. It was about the power of human connection in the darkest moment. Everyone has something they can give to someone who's hurting, she would say. It doesn't have to be a song. It just has to come from the heart. The impact extended beyond the foundation. Medical professionals began documenting the therapeutic effects of personalized music for pediatric patients. The Sarah effect, as some researchers called it, showed measurable improvements in patient mood, treatment compliance, and even pain management when children received customized musical messages. In her final months, Sarah often reflected on the strange journey that had begun with Elvis's death and led to a movement that touched thousands of lives. Sitting in her bedroom, now refilled with Elvis memorabilia sent by fans around the world who'd heard her story, she would listen to the original recording and marvel at how 12 minutes had created ripples that seemed to expand endlessly. They called it Elvis's final gift, she told a documentary filmmaker who was creating a film about the foundation's work. But I think it was really his first gift to the next generation. He showed us that when you're facing the end, what matters isn't what you take with you, it's what you leave behind for others. The wisdom in those words came from someone who'd faced her own mortality with extraordinary grace. Sarah had used her remaining time to ensure that other children wouldn't feel alone in their battle. She'd transformed a personal moment of comfort into a public movement of compassion. During her final interview, recorded just weeks before her death, Sarah was asked what she thought Elvis would say about the foundation created in their shared honor. She smiled, the same bright smile that had captivated everyone who met her, and said, "I think he'd be proud that one small act of kindness became something so much bigger. But mostly, I think he'd be happy that no child has to fight alone anymore." The interviewer asked if she had any regrets about never meeting Elvis in person. Sarah considered the question carefully, then shook her head. "I did meet him," she said simply. "Every time I played that tape, every time I saw another child get their own personal song, every time someone told me my story gave them hope, Elvis was right there." Some meetings happen in ways you never expect. Sarah Mitchell passed away on December 8, 1977, exactly 4 months after Elvis Presley's death. Her funeral was attended by over 800 people, including several of Elvis's former band members who performed "You'll Never Walk Alone" as a tribute to both the king and the brave young woman who'd carried his final message into the world. But Sarah's story didn't end with her death. The foundation that bore her name continued to grow, eventually providing comfort to over 50,000 children in its first decade alone. The Personal Song Project inspired similar programs internationally, creating a network of musicians, celebrities, and ordinary people who believed in the healing power of personalized kindness. Today, Sarah's bedroom has been preserved as part of a small museum in Memphis, located just blocks from where Elvis grew up in Lauderdale Courts. Visitors can listen to the original recording through headphones, read the handwritten letter Elvis sent her, and learn about the foundation that transformed one man's final gift into a lasting legacy of hope. The cassette tape itself, now carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage, remains one of the most requested items for display at Elvis exhibitions worldwide. But its real power isn't as a collector's item. It's as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the ability to light up someone else's world. The final words on Sarah's gravestone, chosen by her parents, read simply, "She taught us that love never dies, it just changes form." Below that inscription is a small musical note, and the phrase that Elvis sang to her in his final recording, "You'll never walk alone." Next time you hear someone facing an impossible battle, remember Sarah Mitchell and Elvis Presley. Remember that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes, and that the gifts we give in our final moments might be the ones that matter most. In a world that often feels too busy for individual kindness, their story reminds us that taking 12 minutes to tell someone they're not alone can echo through generations. What gift will you leave behind?